Welcome to Nevada Women's Film Festival Program 6 Live Q&A. My name is Veronica Castillo, and running behind the scenes, I also have my partner, Jemsen Yumico Bollozos, as our tech producer, working on Eventive and Zoom. Both of us are co-founders of Eccentric Artists, working as the festival's executive committee this year. So without further ado, I'd like to personally introduce our moderator for today. Dr. Heather Addison is the chair department for UNLV Film. She's part of the board of directors for Nevada Women's Film Fest. She's a film scholar who has taught a broad range of courses in film history, criticism, and theory. She studies Hollywood's relationship to American culture and has published her work in a large number of peer-reviewed journals. So thank you, Dr. Addison, and I'll let you take over. We'll see you in a little bit.
Welcome everyone who's here virtually, either as our panelists or as our guests. We're very pleased to have you here. I'd like to introduce our panelists. I will begin with Chen Drachman, who is here from the Book of Ruth. She is writer, executive producer, and central cast member for the Book of Ruth. So welcome, Ms. Drachman, to our virtual Q&A. Lovely to have you here. And then I'd also like to welcome Lucia Starbuck, who is here, the director for Biggest Little Street Companions, a very compelling documentary. Welcome, Ms. Starbuck. Yay. And finally, last, but of course not least, I'd like to welcome Cheryl Halpern, a producer director for Kanda, Bode, or Don't Get Whipped. Good advice.
Good to be with you.
Who is coming to us from New Jersey. So some of you may have questions in mind for our filmmakers already, or questions may come to mind as our conversation begins. So please feel free to post those and we'll address them as time allows. So I'd like to begin with a question to all of our artists, just to kind of get things started. And I guess I'll ask you first, Ms. Drachman, to address the question. Can you talk about the genesis of your film? What drew you to the project, and what do you hope it will give to audiences?
Yeah, I mean, the Book of Ruth is, I keep saying, it's 14 minutes long, and it took 5 years to make those 14 minutes. It all started, I guess we'll go into spoilers, so I'm hoping people get the chance to watch. It started in 2015 when the Eccentric House in Amsterdam released the study, and they do it every other year or so. People don't realize there's still a lot of material that hasn't been used. And that study specifically spoke about the fact that she actually died in a different date than originally assumed, based on new eyewitnesses and stuff like that that came to light. And there was this one media outlet that reported about the story, but made a little grammatical error that made it sound like her fate was actually unknown. It kind of left it vague. Now, unfortunately, we know exactly what happened to her, but that vagueness kind of led me to think, oh, interesting. Like, what if she was still alive today? What kind of person will she be? Where in the world would she be? What would be the motive of her choices? And kind of like trying to answer these questions is what led to the script, which, you know, there were different versions over the years. We've done a live reading in the JCC Manhattan with Tova Feldschuh, who ended up also starring in the movie. And I think my director, Beck Ruff, and our producer, Katie Gold, they joined about a year before we shot. So I had to live with myself for quite a long time. But it was nice to keep in touch with Tova over the years and kind of check in every now and then, and eventually have her come and do it on the screen as well. And I guess what I'm hoping people will get from it is, you know, they leave the theater also thinking a little bit about what if, and also thinking about some of the themes that we see in the movie. A little bit is about memory, about roots, a little bit about what I call the dark side of fame. I think we have this tendency to express some sort of ownership over famous people. Some of them are not famous by choice. So hopefully people will kind of like consider all those aspects.
Ms. Halpern, would you care to go next? Just telling us about the genesis of your film and what you hope audiences may, you know, draw from it.
Well, my co-director, Fakad Kiros, is a wonderful Ethiopian young woman. And we had worked on a previous documentary which was award winning. And Fakad said, Cheryl, come back to Ethiopia. I want to show you more of my country. And she took me to the southern part of Ethiopia where you have a number of tribes that exist within that part of the geography. We went to see the Hammer tribe, and there are other tourists who are there. And all of a sudden, everybody is taking photos of this rite de passage of a man jumping over bulls. Okay, there wasn't an apparent danger to the young man. But after he did this, there started and followed the whipping of women. And I looked at Fakad and I said, what's going on here? And she said, well, this is part of the tribal tradition. And all these people are taking photos, and I'm appalled. Their skin is being opened up. They're bleeding. Why would this be a tourist attraction? So I spoke to Fakad. I said, we need to find out more about the tribe, why they're doing this, and can the tradition evolve? Because there is harm to the woman that is being done. And Fakad agreed. So we decided, we journeyed together to find why the whipping occurred. And we met a young man who said, I don't want the women who I love to be whipped when my child, my male son, would be going over the bulls. I'd rather the women just sing and dance. And to enable change, she wrote a piece of music called Kanda Bode, Don't Get Whipped. And the expectation that Fakad and I have is that within the tribal communities, which are not close to each other, not readily accessible by road, we put this dock, actually the Kanda Bode part of the song, onto a monitor that we have brought into the marketplace, so that when the tribe's people gather at the market, they'll listen to the song and the lyrics in their native dialect and give thought to change. Because change really cannot be imposed from without. It has to be brought forward from within. And that's really what this is about. And also to discourage tourists, because don't applaud the whipping of women. Better to applaud song and dance, and then be participatory, if possible, in that context. And that's the story.
Wow, there's a lot to unpack there. We'll circle back to you after Lucia's had a chance to tell us a little bit about her film. So Lucia, what about the genesis of this? It was actually an issue I hadn't thought about before, so I appreciated learning about it. So how did you come to it, and what do you hope audiences will get from your film?
So my film was actually a follow-up as well to another documentary. First, I profiled this group of anarchists that come together and host potlucks for some of our unsheltered community members. And through that reporting and filmmaking, I talked to a lot of folks with pets, and I was kind of like, hey, where do you sleep at night? And what is it like having a pet? How are you treated? And I just had a lot of conversations with people who had dogs and cats, or they were like, and a lot of it was like, well, I can't, this is my dog now, it was a friend's and now it's mine. So just kind of figuring out those obstacles. And then I learned at this time, this was a year or so ago, that there wasn't any shelter space for folks with their pets. So they couldn't get into a shelter. They tell your pet to go to the SPCA, and people were like, well, I can't, that's my companion. So I just really wanted to explore those relationships and kind of what it's like to experience homelessness with a pet. And I hope people get out of it just to be, kind. And what I really wanted to get across was that the people that I spoke to treat their pets so well, and like they are fed first before themselves. And I just hope to get that point across, to just, you know, be a little kind and realize that these pets are like so well taken care of and loved, and it's just like a nice mutual relationship, and to just bring about hopefully some change to like allow pets at shelter spaces, which we do have some in Reno, Nevada now.
Yeah, I mean, it was extraordinary to just hear the lengths to which they go to make sure their pets are having a wonderful life. And even just considering that a dog that doesn't live in a house is not necessarily a mistreated dog. In fact, it might actually be a happier dog. So a revelation for all of us. So I guess perhaps I'll start with you for the second round of questions, which I'd also like to address to each of the artists. So from your perspective, so you directed the film, you're the driving force behind the film. What was the most difficult challenge you faced, you know, during pre-production, shooting, or post-production for this project?
I think one of the things I biggest challenge was just like nervousness approaching people with a camera, kind of saying, hey, you know, I'm working on this documentary. I see you have a pet there. Can I talk to you and hear your story? That's just, I mean, it's always a little nerve wracking approaching someone on the street. And I'm like, well, someone did that to me, I'd be a little freaked out. That, and then, you know, this isn't like a source that I can just call and like, you know, or send an email to. It's just kind of like a lot of being on the ground and finding out like where people are and where they're hanging out. So it's just kind of, I think, just spend a lot of time like sourcing and making like just hoping that people would trust me to like share like just a really like personal story with me.
You already jumped in with one of the questions I had for you, which is how you connected with your interview subjects. Because as you say, you don't just like look up the roster and start, you know, reaching out to houseless individuals. And it feels like you have a very good and respectful like rapport with your subjects. So I don't know if you want to add a bit to that right now. How did you like identify your subjects and connect with them?
It was kind of just like just being super honest, like, hey, hi, I have a camera in my backpack, and just letting them know, you know, this is what I'm working on. I want to share your story, whatever you're comfortable with, and just kind of hanging out with them and their dog during the day, like there was like a place where dogs used to be able to hang out during the day. So I just kind of go over there. And I think it's just mostly being super honest and like transparent about what I'm doing, and like whatever, like however I can make them most comfortable too.
Yeah, I could feel that in your footage. So well done. If I may use everyone's first name, I hope that's okay. Chen, if you could also talk about, you did many things for this incredible film. And as a Walking Dead fan, I have to say, shout out to Tova Feldshuh when she showed up. Oh my goodness. So what, you know, challenges, or what's the most challenging thing you faced, you know, in any of your roles, whether it was performance or writing or, you know, exec producing?
I actually like pretty much figured it out. I think wearing many hats was a bit, I think the boring answer would be time and money, because of course we tried very hard to shoot it within 2 days, which was very, very tight, and another half day in the new studio in New York, which you have like teeny tiny scene there. But I think that's always the fear, is like, how do I do all of this? And you know, in addition to what you mentioned, I was also kind of location scouting. So sort of like location, not manager, but like I have to go and find the location, research the location. So you know, I guess in filmmaking, when you say producer or executive producer, it means so many other things, like looking at catering and stuff like that. I think my greatest fear was on the day to just not be able to focus on acting. And I mean, I'm not an American, so there's also an accent aspect to it. So I feel like I really needed to concentrate on the dialogue, while also seeming authentic, but also in my head, like, what is happening in the next door? Did we just break something, which we did? So there was that. When my accent coach was there on set with me, squeezing himself into teeny tiny corners, trying to really lesson. It was much easier in prep, because when we were prepping, they could just focus on prep. Being on set and really letting go, admittedly, didn't always work out. So I think you pretty much guessed it. Yeah, that's, you know, I hope none of the aspects suffer too much. I hope each one of them ended up being like 85%, because I think it's quite impossible to do like 100% multiple things, so hopefully.
And it's relatively unique for someone who is the writer to also be a performer. I mean, we often hear about writer-directors. So how was that for you? Like writing, like did you see new things in your script when you were actually trying to play a role in it, an active role in front of the camera? Did it change for you?
It's very interesting. I think the benefit of writing it is that I can visualize, and if I know that I write for myself, which essentially I do, part of why I write is so that I can act, because I really love acting. I can visualize myself in the situation. So I don't know if the script really changed, like if acting changed stuff in the script for me as much as all of a sudden the dynamic, because when I was just envisioning how I would deliver a line, it's one thing. All of a sudden, I have a whole family dynamic around me, and I think that informed the acting more than what was on the page. So that was really, really nice. And of course, when Becca joined, and then Caitlin, and so everyone has a different input, and that thing keeps like growing into its own thing. Aside from how I wrote it, which was also really, really nice. So yeah.
Thank you. And then finally going to you, Cheryl, if you would just like to talk about what you see as the biggest challenge for you in this project, whether it was pre-production shooting or in post.
Well, it's not that simple a question, thank you.
How about picking a challenge?
Okay, so sort of an evolutionary process. I was very, very lucky. Fakad and I were both lucky that Landala, the man who created the music, happened to have been our guide to visit the Hammer tribe. And he took us on a 5K walk to visit his elder and his village, where we were warmly welcomed. And young man within his village was the groom-to-be who had just jumped over the bulls. And Landala was able to translate, that was probably the most challenging piece of this whole project. The Hammer dialect is very different than Amharic, the national language of Ethiopia. So we really needed him to communicate with the elder to learn more about the marriage rite and the rite de passage of a young man into adulthood. And the elder just embraced Fakad and I, gave us the gourd filled with their local liquid product. I have no idea what it is. And we drank a toast together, at which point it broke all barriers. And he said, basically, he trusted us to tell the Hammer story. And he approved of Landala's music. And so he liked the concept of doing something and bring it into the tribal market to share with the other elders and the other members of the tribe. So once we achieved that, Fakad and I were committed to telling the story. But when I went with her to Landala's village, the spotlight became on me because I'm blonde. I am not dark-skinned. I was the interesting person within the village. And so made a decision together with Fakad that for the actual film shoot, which took 3 days, morning, noon, and night, I was not going to be there. I did not want to be a distraction. We had 2 cameras. I wanted them to be able to clearly get the faces, the emotions, the dancing, the whipping, without my presence being in any way a deterrence or a hindrance. So that's really the challenges with regard to pre-production. Post-production, again, when you're trying to timestamp something, but the people are speaking in a dialect that nobody else understands, finding the translator who could listen to the hammer, put it into Amharic, and then allow the translation from Amharic to English. And that's the story.
So you co-directed with Fakad, but you had to basically give your perspective all in pre-production.
Correct. Yeah.
That's very interesting. So did you two get really specific about what you wanted, what was going to be shot? Because documentaries have various degrees of pre-planning. So I don't know if you had, a loose idea of what you hoped to get, or you were open, to more impromptu things. Like how specific was the planning?
We knew we wanted to support Landala in order to create change and to create, perhaps for the next generation, a reluctance for the girls and the women to be whipped. So with that as the banner, we had to go and interview those from the older generation who had been whipped, those from the older generation who did the whipping, those from the younger generation who were recently whipped, those from the younger generation who recently did the whipping, and to draw them out as to what their thoughts were about the tradition. Should it continue as is? Should it change? And that's why you see there are many from the younger generation who said, we've been whipped, but we wouldn't want our child to be whipped. And you have a number of the men who say, we're not comfortable whipping. We don't want to do this. We'd be happier with just song and dance. So that was the broad outline. We do not script. So again, ask questions, absolutely. Go to the doctor who has to attend to those who will come to the clinic. Broad questions. Let them put their words, their emotions before the camera. And then it comes to, quite frankly, the editing afterwards. But that's why we did 3 days of A and B roll and just let it run. You never know what you're going to find.
Yeah, there's a real respect for the subjects in this film, for letting them speak for themselves. And I feel like that really came through. So I want to applaud you for that. I mean, I think the same is also true for your film, Lucia. You were, looking at different subjects across the world. But that's been an evolution in, the documentary craft, like going from like the voice of God narration days, where the documentaries just tells people what to think about the subject, to a period in which I think we often struggle to kind of negotiate that, because the filmmaker is always presenting some sort of perspective, deciding where to place the camera, what to include. So it's not just an objective, recording of reality, but it's very nicely negotiated, I feel, in our 2 doc examples on this panel. All right, so I've got specific questions for each of you. I might go first to, well, I guess I'll go to you, Lucia. So as I said, this was my first kind of introduction to thinking about this problem, and the way you laid it out was so dramatic. Like even in just the first couple minutes of the film, like they love these pets, someone's going to take these pets away from them, there's no way they can be inside with their pets. So right away I was riled up and involved in the film. So then it led me to wonder, like, how extensive is this problem? Did you get a sense of what percentage of houseless individuals are trying to have pets or would like a pet if they could have one? and whether like pets of the homeless, like how wide their reach is, how supportive they can be, because their funding might be quite small. So maybe if they have 100 homeless people calling for support, they can only help one. So if you can talk a little bit about that, like the scale of the problem and the scale of current solutions, at least what you've been able to learn.
Yeah, I think one issue that kind of gets brought up again and again is that we don't have like this strong data on this. I mean, we have like this point in time count, which tries to get an idea of how many people are experiencing homelessness on a given night, and that's like has its own flaws. So like we just don't really have like the data to say like to kind of give that scale. But I think what we are seeing is like, so what we got a new shelter I think like a moment, maybe like mid-May this year. And you can already see that there are already a lot of pets, like on those first few weeks, there's already pets. And I've been kind of speaking to shelters that say like, that is the number one thing that keeps people out of shelters is not having pets. So I think like, I can't give you a number, but I can say it's enough to like, to know that there's a need in the region and to like, and how crucial it is for that need to be met. In one of our shelters in Sparks, there's a pet turtle. So there is like quite a range. And for Pets of the Homeless, I know that they've helped a lot of people. I mean, even when we were there kind of filming one afternoon and they were getting calls. I think the issue is, and what I ran into with one of my sources, Annette, was that you like, just being able to contact and stay in contact with Pets of the Homeless. She with Annette's home, she's like, I don't have a phone. Like, I don't know. Like, I kind of have their card. They spoke to me once one-on-one, but now I don't know how to get a hold of them. So I think the issue is like just making sure that there's that access to people with pets. I think they can help and they want to help, but I mean, it's also in Carson City, so it's the next city over from us. So it can just be hard to reach people. So I'm sorry I don't have a number, but
no, that's okay.
You can kind of see through like what is needed and like, and that the shelters like are like finally kind of having kennels and spaces for pets, because that's what I am hearing. It is like so hard. Like that is one of the biggest things, that and like being able to stay in like a family unit and like a couple.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume if there was support for houseless individuals to have pets, that many of them would, maybe as many as those of us who are housed, because most people I know have one or more pets. So one assumes that, you know, the companionship they bring is so critical that why wouldn't we want everyone to have that, especially when like sleeping next to a dog can help protect you. You know, if you're out in the weather, that could potentially save your life. So it's brings wonderful benefits that unfortunately are not available because of the system we have in place, which we've been noticing for so many political and social problems, and especially in these last couple of years that the pandemic has exposed. And I think it's made, especially in the US, homelessness even a bigger challenge than it has been. Ken, I'd like to go next to you to the Book of Ruth. And so this film has so much in it. I'm so thrilled I get to speak with the writer because I think the writing is brilliant. The film's like nuanced presentation of identity, persona, and like the symbolism that it brings really made me think, like, what does it mean to actually be someone? And there's a quick early reference in the film to Anastasia Romanoff, which I think is then great foreshadowing for the film's central question: who is Anne Frank? Or who do we need her to be? So Ruth suggests that Anne Frank's name and legend mean more than the physical life of the person who was Anne Frank as a child. So can you talk a little bit about how you approach the notion of identity in the script or, you know, as part of your performance?
Thank you for noticing all of this. The Anastasia one specifically was, I appreciate it. I think it's a bit of a loaded question, right? Because like we're going to talk about someone who died in a tragic way, so it's kind of tricky, and I think that's actually part of why we chose to leave so much of it open to interpretation, because maybe you live in the theater thinking that this version of her, like, envisioning a completely different version of her than what we thought. Even within the team, we had these discussions like, I don't know if it should be that, I don't know if it should be like that. In earlier drafts, we were kind of implying that she's actually a published author under a pseudonym, and we had little things on that actually did not make it into the final cut. But unfortunately, I do think it's true. I mean, if she lived, it's tricky, right? Because we do know Holocaust survivors, and their stories are very, very important. And I think she even says this in the movie, like, even if she lived, she would have lived as a Holocaust survivor. But, and it's like if she was just a regular kid and she grew up and, you know, we don't know what kind of person she would end up being, we would not have been talking about her as much as we are. So unfortunately, she did turn out to be a symbol of what might have been of the abrupt end, which is something that's also we're mentioning in the script. But I really like the idea that someone who's been through what she has been through, what the movies implying that she's been through, which is still going through the camp, still, you know, going through the Holocaust, would be someone very open-minded, which is part of why we wanted to make one of her grandkids a member of the LGBTQ+ community, because like it would be, to me, like it's very hard. You're trying to think what sort of person who's been through a trauma would act like, be like, and the reality is that everyone reacts differently to trauma. And I see it in my own family because my grandpa was a Holocaust survivor. He never wanted to talk about it. Some people never want to talk about it. Some people see it as a calling to talk about it. So, but I was trying to think, like, you know, if we look at her writings at a very early age, if we look at her diary, then she does seem like someone who would be open-minded, who would be artistic, who loves nature. So I think that when we got to the point of like, or when I got to the point of shaping who she would be all these years later, I wanted to have these things from her writing as an anchor. To at the very least be like, okay, she could evolve in that way. I think she would be socially active. I think she'll be someone who fights for human rights, even if it's again as a writer of the singing or like, you know, you don't have to know who she is for her to be out on the streets and protests. I think she'll be very accepting and a non-judgmental person. But this version, she doesn't want to talk about her trauma. And the reason that she doesn't want to talk about her trauma is because her trauma is actually open to the entire world because of her diary and how, you know, it ended up being. And I think a lot of people resent their fame, especially if like it's not something that they chose for themselves. And she's saying this in the script, you know, I'm forced to believe what happened by the fact that my story is just out there in the open for everyone. And I was kind of like trying to compare it to like a modern day situation. If this book was published without her consent, of course she couldn't give her consent. I was saying if that was the scenario, I think it would be kind of like the equivalent of like when someone's cloud is being hacked and private photos of like a celebrity made it out there. It wasn't necessarily their choice. Just because she wrote something doesn't mean, you know, and I'm not getting into the psychology because it's got the blessing of her family. And she herself expressed wants to down the line become a writer, which we don't know because we'll never know what she would have wanted. But so I think we're trying to kind of like take all these small nuances into consideration and get into a version that can be one of many versions of who she would have been today.
The scene in which, you know, you two have that dialogue when you're trying to, you know, when you feel like you as her granddaughter have the truth and you want her to just come clean, admit the truth, go public with the truth, she's, you know, very perceptive about trying to tell you that there are multiple truths and that it might actually be better for her and better for the public if she stays where she is, because then she doesn't reopen her trauma and she doesn't change this image of Anne Frank that the world has, that maybe the world needs to represent the millions of children whose diaries weren't there to document their suffering. I found it a very moving and well, you know, directed and well performed and well written scene.
Thank you.
Okay, so that brings me then back to Cheryl. So for Kanda Bode, or Don't Get Whipped. So one of the things that really struck me about this film, so it's a nuanced consideration of very difficult subject matter women getting whipped to the point of being bloody and scarred. So like an instinctive reaction might just be anger at the Ikuli, the men who are perpetrating the act. But the documentary takes care to reveal that the situation is much more complex, with long traditions that prompt both males and females to support and participate in the ceremony. So how did you approach that complexity and try to portray it? And I know you've said some things about that already, but I think kind of an instinctive reaction is like, men are whipping women, men must be at fault. But the documentary tries to really present this notion that it's really a system in which, you know, both men and women believe in this tradition for various kinds of reasons. So in order for change to take place, they both have to be convinced that it's necessary. So I don't know if you want to say something about that.
Well, you're quite on the mark. And that's what Landela was trying to achieve. The elders would get together and speak about change, especially when it became more evident that from a health perspective, there were significant issues. The woman who gets, you know, whipped on her breasts, who then needs to get a mastectomy, and the psychological impact within the village when she is nursing a child. The elders are not blind, nor are they deaf, and they're aware that there are ramifications within each of their villages, but they can't impose. And the Ethiopian government, to its credit, has taken a position in opposition to the whipping. But again, they cannot impose. They are not going to be able to go in and imprison somebody for engaging in a tribal tradition. So there has to be teaching. There has to be the ability to make both the men and the women aware of the consequences of the whipping. And so rather than trying to come from a Western perspective, we had to present a tribal perspective. And that's where Landela and the music, the lyrics in their dialect became so important. To discuss the pride of the rite de passage of the young male into adulthood, to applaud their singing, their dancing, their exuberance, and then to show the women there's another way. Your scars are there, but they don't have to be there. And I think Landela did it very well with his lyrics. If you're being whipped as a way of showing your family that this is your way of supporting, applauding, and celebrating with them and helping, there is more to helping within the family, whether it's working with the goats, going and bringing the twigs, the lumber, so to speak, into your village, taking care of food and, harvesting. You don't have to be whipped. It's not going to diminish your presence in the village. It is only an enhancement of your presence in the village. So that's what we were all about. But you can't make that happen unless, as I said earlier, you've got to see and speak to the generations. Those that come from a strong traditional past, the younger members who are engaging in the ceremony as younger generations, but then to think about, what do you want for your children? And pose that question to both the men and the women.
That's beautiful.
That's where the change will come.
Yes. And maybe someday women will actually get a chance to do prove their physical daring. Maybe they'll get a chance to leap over the bulls. I know I'd want to
One
do
never
that.
knows.
I want to thank you all for your time here. I've been getting notices from our production team that I need to wrap up because we've hit our 40-minute limit. I want to note that this session is being recorded and will be used for future educational purposes, particularly for our students. So I just want to thank you for not only sharing your films with us, but also your time, because that's so important for students to get a sense of like the context for the work. So it's invaluable. Thank you so much, all three of you, for being with us today from across the United States and the world, at least in terms of the people who contributed to the films. So farewell. And is there any last thing you would like to add, maybe 30 seconds each?
It was great.
Thank you. Cheryl or Lucia?
I want to
anything very
say
quick?
thanks to all of you. And Lucia, you opened my eyes to a issue that I never, ever considered. And Chen, coming from a Holocaust background, you too have exposed me to a concept I never considered before. So thank you all.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful learning opportunities, but the films are also really successful as cinema, as intensely involving entertainment. So I just want to emphasize that too, because they really appeal on an emotional level. And I think that's the mark of truly, transcendent filmmaking. So thank you. And I guess farewell, everyone. Veronica, do I just hit end here?
To be continued.
To be continued.
Jemsen will take care of it. But
Alrighty
everyone,
then.
thank you. We'll see you later.
Okay, farewell all.